This is a map. And you're thinking to yourself, yes, I know that is a map. Yes, you are an intelligent human being. You know this is a map. This is a very significant and important map. This is a map of the Fertile Crescent. And you're thinking to yourself, what is a Fertile Crescent? That is a good question. What is a Fertile Crescent? What is a crescent? Well, if you know anything about the phases of the moon, then you know a crescent is a sort of a semi-moon shape where it curves, which is interesting because if you look at the green parts on the map, they are kind of in a curved pattern. What's more significant is the word fertile. What does the word fertile mean? Because this right here is a location of the foundation of human civilization. It's a big statement, but fertile plays into that because if this is where the first cities were built and this is where human population really began to grow in large numbers, what does the word fertile have to do with that? Is it an important factor? Perhaps, perhaps not. But really, if you think about it, the word fertile plays into our understanding of modern civilization today. We would not have the iPad, the iMac, or the anything really without this part of the world. We wouldn't have cities. We wouldn't have all the benefits of large populations. We wouldn't have extra food and technology and pollution and traffic, and I think you get the idea. But let's look on further and see what developed in this particular part of the world. Now, 10,000 and years and beyond that, this is how all people lived. So take a look at these two images. What you see here on the top is a group of men hunting. Notice the bows and arrows. Notice the interesting loincloths that they're wearing. Now, if you look at the bottom picture, what you see there are women gathering. This is what generally people did. They had very gender-specific roles. Men generally hunted, although I'm sure there are exceptions, and women generally gathered, although I'm sure there were exceptions. But this is how things worked pretty much everywhere until at some point someone figured out that you don't necessarily have to travel to find food. Perhaps you can grow it yourself. But look carefully at these pictures. What do you think would be the challenges that humans would face living this type of lifestyle? And there would be challenges. But let's think about that and think about these pictures as we look at further pictures and start to compare them and find out the differences and the changes in human lifestyle. Now, this next picture takes place sometime around 7000 BCE, roughly about 9,000 years ago. At some point, someone figured out that they could grow their own food. They didn't have to travel to find it. But that took some time. This wasn't an overnight thing, and it only happened in small pockets of people. But it is possible that someone, likely women, thought that perhaps they could plant their own seeds in areas. So when they traveled back to a certain part of wherever they normally traveled around, because they're nomads, they would have extra food to gather and therefore more food to eat, which means more people survive. Eventually, over generations, over time, it is possible that people figured out that they didn't have to travel to find food. They could make the risk and actually stay and grow their own food. Now, this took a lot of time and a lot of trial and error with farming. It wasn't something that people figured out automatically. It took practice, but they did figure it out. Now, how would the challenges of their lifestyle be different than the challenges of the people in the previous pictures? What would be different? What would be significantly different? What would be scary different? But these are definitely thoughts to consider. Now let's look and see what happened when people got better at farming. Villages, towns, crops, and look, animals. Now first people figured out farming. They learned to grow their own food. They began living in permanent settlements, which means they had to build homes. Over several generations, hundreds of years of perhaps, maybe even thousands, I think I'm probably exaggerating a bit, but certainly over several generations, eventually they figured out that not only could they grow their own food, they could actually raise their own animals and kill them and eat them, and they don't have to chase these animals down anymore. That simplifies life quite a bit. So if you look in the picture, people actually, you see men and women working together side by side. You see this child with his cattle. You see a woman back there drying out animal skins to make clothing. You can see the fields in the background. So what you have right here is the first villages, and this is all taking place in the Fertile Crescent. Now, this is all still during the Neolithic period, which means New Stone Age. Once people figured out farming, this becomes the New Stone Age, which means that people are still using stone tools. But once they settle in the villages, they start doing really interesting things like making pottery, which is very important. And they're learning to trade with one another. They're building trade networks because it's not just one village. You slowly have the growth of many villages. And when you have the growth of many villages and you have more people, something interesting begins to occur. But now compare these people with the people of, say, the hunter-gatherers. What are the changes now? What are the significant changes? What are the drastic changes? What are the exciting changes? What you have here is the growth of cities. This is a drawing of what the city of Ur might have looked like at the height of its development. Now, what's interesting here is over time, people learned how to make bricks. Now, in this part of the world, there's not a huge abundance of trees, but what they have a lot of is dirt and mud. Notice there's water. This part of the world is controlled by two very large rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so these civilizations develop between these two significantly large rivers. And so there's a lot of water, there's a lot of dirt, therefore you have a lot of mud. And so they learned to make mud bricks, dry them out in the sun, and they made amazingly good building materials. The first cities were built by the Sumerians, and they were cities like Ur and Uruk. These people built walls around their cities. They created armies. They had incredibly complex buildings. They built ziggurats, temples to worship their gods, and they were polytheistic. They had many gods and goddesses. In fact, the Sumerians had hundreds and hundreds of gods and goddesses. They learned how to work metal. They created bronze. And that's what started, that was the next era after the Neolithic period, was the Bronze period. Eventually we'll start, the Iron Age will begin, but right now we're in the Bronze Age. People are making metal. They are making jewelry out of copper and gold. They are also on the verge of making some very significant human discoveries, which is going to change the world permanently. But now let's think again. How is this civilization different from that of the hunter-gatherers? Look at the massive differences. You used to have people traveling nomadically from place to place, and now you have people not only living in settled locations, but they're building these enormous cities, things that people had never, ever done before. These people are the pioneers of architecture. Well, these Sumerians were clever. They built cities, and then they began to really make some changes. They discovered something called the wheel. And at this point, you're yawning and thinking, so what? Well, so what? Think of your life without the wheel. There are no cars. There is no transporting large things from one place to another. The wheel is the most necessary invention that humans ever came up with, and it took them a while. The first vehicles were actually sleds. Can you imagine traveling across a desert, pulling a sled across the dirt? Remember, this part of the world does not get snow, only in the very highest mountains, and not a lot of people lived up there. Most people lived in the valleys around the water. Remember, no water, no survival. So these people are learning how to build the wheel. And if you really look at nature, there aren't too many examples of a circle. You have to look into the sky to see a circle. What are your two examples? The sun and the moon. So these people actually looked up, and someone figured out, hey, that's a pretty cool shape, and made a wheel, and then discovered, hey, if I strap this onto two of these onto a board, I can move large stuff around. And that is a huge step forward in human civilization. And the wheel was probably only invented around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. So it's really, really recent in terms of human development. I know you're thinking, good God, how can 5,000 years be recent? But really, when you think that humans have only been around for 150 to possibly 200,000 years, 5,000 years, it's pretty darn recent. What else did they invent? They invented something called writing. The Sumerians invented something called cuneiform, a very complex and difficult form of writing. This right here is a picture of a tablet of cuneiform. They basically made tablets out of mud. They wrote in them and then they let them dry. They didn't have paper. It won't be until the Egyptians invent papyrus at a much later date that the first paper comes around. But it's really the Chinese that perfect it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago and create the first paper. So until then, people are writing on stone tablets, and so not everybody knows how to write. It's actually a very small proportion of Sumerian population that knows how to write, and they are male and they are wealthy. But look at that, human writing. About 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, people start writing things down, and the Sumerians had a lot to say. There are a lot of these tablets. And the last of the significant inventions I'm going to really go over here is education. With writing comes learning. So we start off with a map. We go to human society that's most primitive, and we have actually, in a few short slides, explored thousands of years of human development and have led us right here to little boys sitting in a classroom learning how to read and write, just like you.